It was a quiet evening on the outskirts of Springfield, Ohio. The air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves, and the sun was setting behind the row of empty houses. On one of those porches sat Martha Evans, a frail old woman in her late 70s, rocking slowly in her chair. Her wrinkled hands clutched a faded photograph, the only memory she had left of her husband and son. She often spoke to herself, as if the wind carried her words to those long gone. "You both promised you'd come back," she whispered, her voice trembling, "and I'm still waiting." Neighbors rarely saw her. Those who did said she lived between memories and silence. The porch had become her world, her companion through loneliness. Inside the house, everything was still. The walls covered with old pictures, the air filled with the smell of time and dust. That evening, as she looked at the fading sky, she said softly, "If tonight is my last night, I just wish to see one familiar face again." And then, for the first time in years, she thought she heard footsteps approaching her gate.
Martha's heart skipped a beat as the sound of footsteps drew closer. For a moment, she thought it might be her imagination, just another trick her lonely mind played on her. But then the wooden gate creaked open, and a shadow fell across the porch. A young man stood there, maybe in his early 30s, dressed in a worn-out jacket and carrying a small backpack. His hair was messy, and his eyes looked tired, as if he had walked a long way. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm sorry if I startled you. I was just looking for a place to rest for a bit. The bus station's closed, and I've been walking for hours." Martha's eyes, dimmed by age, blinked as she tried to make out his face. There was something familiar, something about his voice, his stance, but she couldn't place it. "You can sit," she said gently, gesturing to the steps. "No one visits this house anymore." He smiled politely and sat down. For a few moments, silence hung between them, broken only by the creak of her rocking chair. After a while, Martha spoke again. "What's your name, son?" He hesitated. "Daniel," he replied. "Daniel Carter." Martha's hand trembled slightly. That was the same name as her son's best friend, the boy who used to visit her house years ago. She turned toward him, her voice softer now. "Daniel Carter," she murmured. "You used to live down the street, didn't you?" Daniel looked surprised. You remember that?" Martha smiled faintly. "Some memories never fade, dear, especially the ones tied to the people we loved." He looked down at the photograph she was holding, a picture of a young man in uniform. "Is that your son?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, my Michael. He never came back from the war." Daniel's expression darkened. "I knew him," he said. "He saved my life once." Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat. You knew my Michael?" Daniel nodded slowly, and the porch suddenly felt heavy with the weight of the past. Martha's eyes widened, her fingers gripping the armrest of her rocking chair, as if the truth might slip away if she let go. "You knew Michael?" she whispered again, her voice trembling between disbelief and hope. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the photograph in her hands. "Yes, ma'am. We served together, overseas. He wasn't just a soldier. He was the kind of man who carried others' pain like it was his own." Martha's lips quivered, and a tear slid down her cheek. "He was always like that, even as a boy, always trying to fix what wasn't his to fix." The young man smiled faintly. "That sounds like him. I remember one night, during a mission, we were trapped in a field under heavy fire. Everyone was panicking, but Michael stayed calm. He dragged 2 of us to safety before he paused, his throat tightening, before he got hit." Martha covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "They never told me how it happened," she said. "Just a letter and a folded flag." Daniel's voice softened. He was brave, ma'am. He didn't suffer. He was at peace. For a while, neither of them spoke. The evening wind brushed through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain. Daniel watched her carefully, this woman who had carried decades of silence. Then Martha said, almost to herself, "Every night, I pray that he's watching me. Sometimes I talk to his picture. I tell him I made his favorite pie today, or that I kept his room just the way he left it." Daniel's eyes glistened. "He'd be proud of you," he said. Martha gave a frail smile. "And what about you, Daniel? What brings you here, of all places?" He hesitated for a long moment. "I guess I just needed to find some peace too," he said finally. "Maybe I was meant to end up here, with someone who still remembers him." The porch light flickered, and the sound of distant thunder rolled across the horizon. For the first time in years, Martha didn't feel alone. The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping gently against the wooden porch. Martha motioned toward the door. "Come inside, dear. You'll catch a cold out here." Daniel nodded and followed her into the dimly lit house. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. The furniture was covered with crochet, doilies, and family. Pictures lined every shelf, smiling faces frozen in time. On one wall hung a large frame containing Michael's military medals and a neatly folded American flag beneath it. Daniel paused there, staring quietly. "You kept everything just the same," he said softly. "I couldn't change it," Martha replied, her voice distant. "It's all I have left of him. His room, his things. They keep me company when the nights get too quiet." She walked slowly toward the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the teapot. "Would you like some tea, Daniel? It's not much, but it's warm." He smiled gently. "That sounds perfect." As she prepared it, Daniel wandered around, studying the pictures. There was one of a young Michael holding a baseball glove, another of a family picnic by the lake, and one where Martha stood proudly beside her husband in front of the old Ford. "You had a beautiful family," Daniel said when she returned with 2 steaming cups. Martha set them down and nodded. "Yes, I did. My husband, George, was a good man, quiet but strong. He passed not long after Michael's death. Some days I think his heart just gave up." Daniel sat down across from her, his expression full of quiet respect. "Losing both of them. That must have been hard." Martha looked into her cup, her reflection trembling in the tea. "Hard," she repeated softly. "It was like learning how to breathe without lungs. You survive, but you never really live again." Silence filled the room, heavy, but somehow comforting. Then, almost hesitantly, Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out a small metal dog tag. He placed it gently on the table. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Martha froze, her eyes fixed on the tag. Her son's name engraved on the metal, worn but clear. Her trembling hand reached out, and the moment her fingers touched it, tears welled up in her eyes. "Michael Evans," she whispered, her voice breaking. You kept this all these years." Daniel nodded. "He gave it to me that night, told me to bring it home if he didn't make it." The room fell utterly silent, except for the rain softly beating against the windows, as if the heavens themselves were crying with her. Martha held the dog tag close to her chest, her frail hands trembling as she whispered her son's name again and again. It was as if a piece of him had come back home after all these years. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow alone, but of something she hadn't felt in decades. Closure. Daniel watched her silently, his throat tightening. He could see how deeply this moment mattered, how one small piece of metal could bridge a lifetime of grief. "Michael saved me that night," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "We were pinned down in the open, and the others were gone. He pushed me behind a broken wall and said, 'If I don't make it out, tell my mom I kept my promise.'" Martha looked up, her eyes wide. "Promise." Daniel nodded. "He told me about you, how you used to sit on the porch waiting for him to come home from school. He said he promised he'd always come back to you, no matter what. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. She just clutched the tag tighter, holding it close to her heart. And you brought him home, she whispered, finally. You kept his promise when he couldn't. Daniel lowered his head. I owed him my life, ma'am. I just wish I could have come sooner. Martha shook her head gently. You came when you were meant to, she said softly. Sometimes God waits until the heart is ready to heal. The old clock on the wall ticked slowly, its rhythmic sound filling the quiet room. Rain still tapped on the glass, but now it sounded softer, almost like a lullaby. Daniel looked around, noticing a small table by the window. On it sat a single candle, half burned, beside a Bible with a worn-out cover. You light that every night, Haya? He asked. Martha smiled faintly. Every night for 20 years, she said. I tell myself it helps him find his way back. Daniel's voice broke slightly. Maybe tonight he finally did. Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over his. No, Daniel, you brought him home. Maybe that's what this visit was for, not by chance, but by grace. A hush fell over them again, a kind of peace neither of them had known in years. Outside, the rain began to slow, and a faint glow of moonlight broke through the clouds. For the first time in a long time, the old house didn't feel empty anymore. The hours drifted by quietly. The storm outside had faded, leaving only the soft sound of dripping water from the porch roof. The house seemed calmer, warmer, as if the weight of all those silent years had begun to lift. Martha sat in her rocking chair again, the dog tag still resting in her palm. Daniel sat nearby, the soft light from the lamp casting long, gentle shadows across the room. You know, she began softly, Michael used to sit right there, in that same chair you're in now, and tell me about his dreams. He wanted to see the world, to build something meaningful, but most of all, he wanted to make people proud. Daniel smiled faintly. He did that. Every man who served with him respected him. He wasn't just brave. He made us believe we could survive anything. Martha looked at him for a long moment, her eyes misty. You talk about him like he's still here. Daniel hesitated, then said quietly, maybe he is. Sometimes I feel like he's been guiding me ever since that night. Martha's chair creaked as she leaned back, her gaze distant. When someone you love leaves this world, their body goes, but their presence doesn't. It lingers, in the air, in the quiet corners of your heart. Daniel nodded slowly. That's what it feels like. A soft smile appeared on her face. You remind me of him in some ways. Your eyes, the way you listen. Maybe that's why I didn't feel afraid when you came to my porch. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. I think I was meant to find you. She looked at him with gentle eyes. Maybe we were both meant to find each other. Outside, the moon shone brighter, its pale light spilling across the porch floorboards. The world beyond the window felt still, like time itself had paused to listen. Martha spoke again, her tone quieter now. Do you have a family, Daniel? He sighed and looked away. Not anymore. My mother passed a few years back, and I never went back home after the war. I guess I didn't know how to start over. Martha's heart softened. Home isn't a place, dear, she said gently. It's the people who make you feel seen. Daniel looked at her, his eyes glistening. Then maybe I've finally found mine. A single tear rolled down Martha's cheek. Not of pain this time, but of peace. For the first time in 2 decades, she didn't feel abandoned by life. She felt found. When morning came, the first light of dawn slipped through the thin lace curtains, painting the living room in a soft golden glow. The storm had washed the world clean. The air smelled of wet earth and quiet renewal. Martha slowly opened her eyes. Still in her rocking chair, a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, his head resting against the armrest, his backpack tucked beside him. For a long moment, Martha simply watched him. There was something profoundly comforting about his presence, the way he brought life back into a house that had known only silence. She smiled softly. "You look so much like him when you sleep," she whispered. The sound of birds outside broke the stillness. Daniel stirred and sat up, blinking as the sunlight hit his face. "Good morning," he said with a sleepy grin. "Good morning, dear," Martha replied warmly. "I hope the couch wasn't too hard." He chuckled. "It was fine. Honestly, it's the best sleep I've had in a long time." Martha rose carefully, her joints creaking as she steadied herself on the arm of her chair. "I'll make some breakfast. You must be hungry after all that traveling." "You don't have to," Daniel began, but she waved a hand. "Nonsense. It's been years since I've had someone to cook for." He smiled, touched by her kindness. "Then I'd be honored." As Martha moved slowly about the kitchen, Daniel looked around the small dining area. Everything felt timeless. The wooden table, the floral curtains, the ticking of the old clock. It reminded him of home, of the warmth he'd lost long ago. She returned a few minutes later with 2 plates of scrambled eggs and toast. The simple meal felt like a feast after so many lonely nights. They ate quietly at first, sharing small smiles across the table. Then Daniel said softly, "I never really knew what peace felt like until now." Martha looked up, her eyes kind. "Peace isn't found in silence or distance, Daniel. It's found in the moments when your heart feels full again." He nodded slowly, thinking about how right she was. After breakfast, Daniel stood by the window, staring at the open road. "I should probably get going soon," he said hesitantly. "Didn't mean to overstay." Martha's face fell slightly. "Oh, I see." He turned toward her. "But I'll come back. I promise. There's something about this place, about you, that feels like I'm supposed to stay connected." Martha smiled through misty eyes. "Then this old porch will be waiting for you." And as the morning light spilled over them both, it felt like a new beginning. Not just for Daniel, but for Martha too. Days turned into weeks, and true to his word, Daniel came back often. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes flowers from the little roadside stand outside town. But most of all, he brought something Martha hadn't felt in years: laughter. He helped fix things around the house: the porch light that flickered, the creaky front steps, the old radio that hadn't played in decades. "You know," Martha said one afternoon as she watched him work, "Michael used to try fixing that same radio when he was 12. Never got it working either." Daniel grinned. "Then I'm in good company." He gave the side of the radio a gentle tap, and suddenly it crackled to life. Static at first, then the faint sound of old jazz music. Martha gasped. "Oh my, I haven't heard that song since George and I danced at the county fair." Daniel stepped back proudly. "Guess it just needed a little patience." She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Or maybe a little hope. From that day on, the old house didn't feel empty anymore. The radio played in the evenings, and the porch became lively again. Neighbors passing by began to notice Martha sitting outside with a guest, laughing, talking, even sharing tea. For the first time in years, people saw her smile. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, Martha said softly, "You've changed this place, Daniel, and me too." He looked at her with a gentle smile. "You gave me something to come back to. That's more than I could ever ask for." She chuckled. "You talk like a man twice your age." He laughed. "War does that to you, I guess." There was a quiet moment after that, the kind that needed no words. The bond between them had grown deeper than either expected. Daniel had become the son she had lost, and Martha, the mother he never got to say goodbye to. As night fell, Daniel helped her inside and turned off the porch light. But before going to sleep, Martha whispered into the darkness, "Michael, if you can hear me, your friend is home now, and so am I." Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the sound of peace that had finally returned to her heart. The days grew colder as autumn deepened in Springfield. Golden leaves drifted across the porch, and Martha's house now carried the warm scent of cinnamon and baked bread. Every morning, Daniel stopped by before heading to his part-time job at the mechanic shop. He'd bring her coffee and listen to her stories. Stories about her youth, her husband George, and of course, Michael. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the window, Martha was sorting through an old box of photographs. The pictures were faded, their edges curling with time. Daniel joined her, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the coffee table. "That's Michael's graduation," Martha said with a proud smile, pointing to a picture of a young man in a blue gown. "He wanted to study engineering before the war." Daniel traced a finger over the image, his heart tightening. "He looks just like I remember him." Martha chuckled softly. "You boys were always causing trouble back then. I remember the time you two tried to build a go-kart in my backyard." Daniel laughed. "And we broke your garden fence. I still feel bad about that." "Oh, nonsense," she said, waving her hand. "That fence needed fixing anyway." They both laughed, the sound warm and natural, like family. But then Martha's laughter slowly faded, replaced by a thoughtful silence. She picked up one particular photo, a picture of her, George, and Michael standing in front of the house. The colors had almost faded away, but the love in their eyes was still visible. She stared at it for a long while before whispering, "I think it's time this photo goes back on the wall." Daniel helped her stand, and together they hung the picture above the fireplace. When she stepped back to look at it, something inside her seemed to settle, a stillness, a peace that had been missing for too long. "I used to think that wall looked empty because of him," she said quietly, "but maybe it was waiting for the right moment to feel full again." Daniel looked at her, understanding what she meant. "Sometimes," he said, "the past comes back when you're finally ready to love it again." Martha smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears. "You're wise for someone so young?" He chuckled. "Or maybe I just had the right teacher." That night, after Daniel left, Martha lit her candle again. But this time, it wasn't for sorrow or longing. It was for gratitude for the boy who had come back when she needed him most, and for the sun she knew was finally at rest. Autumn had begun to paint the small town with shades of gold and amber. The leaves fell softly around the old wooden house, where Katie now spent most of her days by the window, the same spot where she used to wait for Sam all those years. But now, there was no waiting, only remembering. Every morning, Daniel came by with a basket of fresh bread or flowers from his garden. "You shouldn't be alone," he would say, smiling warmly. Katie would laugh softly. "I was alone for 50 years, Daniel. Now, I finally have company memories." Sometimes they would walk to the lake, the same lake where she and Sam had spent their youth dreaming of a future that never came. Katie would sit on the wooden bench facing the calm water and close her eyes. "Can you hear it?" she would whisper. "Hear what?" Daniel would ask. "The sound of time," she'd reply. "It doesn't take things away. It just keeps them safe until we're ready to find them again." One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Daniel noticed Katie holding something close to her heart, the letter and the pocket watch. "You really loved him," he said softly. Katie smiled, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the dying light. "Love like that doesn't happen twice, Daniel. It's like a single heartbeat that echoes forever." Daniel looked at her with quiet admiration. "I think he'd be proud of you. You never stopped believing." "I couldn't," she replied, "because if I did, I would have lost him completely." She looked at the horizon, the same place where the sun and water kissed each evening. "But I didn't lose him. I just found him again. In you, in the letter, in every sunset." The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Katie took a deep breath, feeling peace settle over her like a warm blanket. "When my time comes," she said softly, "I hope it's by this lake. I want to see the sunset one last time, so I'll know where to find him." Daniel placed his hand gently over hers. "I'll make sure you do." That night, as the town grew quiet and the stars took their places in the dark sky, Katie sat by the window once more. She opened Sam's letter, reading it again and again, tracing every curve of his handwriting. The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady, gentle, eternal. And then she smiled, that same soft smile she used to wear when Sam held her hand all those years ago. "Soon," she whispered into the quiet. "I'll see you soon." The next morning was unusually quiet. The golden light of dawn spilled through the curtains, painting the room in a gentle hue. Daniel knocked on the door, as he did every day, carrying a bouquet of daisies, Katie's favorite flowers. There was no answer. He called out again, his voice trembling slightly. "Katie, it's me." Still nothing. The house felt still, too still. A soft chill ran through him as he opened the door and stepped inside. The clock was ticking. The kettle was cold, and the old radio in the corner was humming faintly, the same song Katie loved. Daniel walked toward the chair by the window, where she always sat waiting for the sunrise. And there she was. Katie sat there peacefully, her eyes closed, her hands resting over the letter and the pocket watch. A calm smile curved her lips, as though she had fallen asleep in the middle of a beautiful dream. The morning light wrapped around her like a soft embrace, and Daniel knew, without a word, that she was gone. For a long moment, he just stood there, tears filling his eyes. He whispered, "You found him, didn't you, Katie?" He sat beside her, his heart heavy, yet strangely comforted. On the table beside her was a small note, written in her graceful, trembling handwriting. "If love is real, it never ends. It only changes form until we find each other again." Daniel pressed the note against his chest, the weight of her words sinking deep into his soul. He looked outside. The sun was rising, and the lake shimmered in gold, just as Katie had always described it. He arranged for her to be buried beside the lake, under the tall oak tree where she and Sam had once carved their names. The whole town gathered, people who had heard her stories, who had seen the sparkle in her eyes when she spoke of Sam. As they laid her to rest, Daniel placed the letter and pocket watch beside her. "He's waiting for you," he whispered, "and now you'll never have to wait again." The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and the sound of rippling water. Somewhere deep in the stillness, Daniel could almost hear two voices laughing, young, free, and full of love. That night, he sat by the lake, watching the stars. The reflection of the moon danced across the water, and for a brief second, he thought he saw two silhouettes walking hand in hand along the shore. Katie and Sam, together at last. He smiled through his tears. "Goodbye, Katie," he whispered. "You finally found your way home." Years passed, and life in the small lakeside town continued to flow gently, like the water that always whispered against the shore. The oak tree where Katie and Sam rested had grown wider, its branches strong and graceful, shading the spot where their names were carved decades ago. Daniel often visited. He had grown older, his hair silver, his steps slower, but his heart still carried the warmth of the woman who taught him the meaning of eternal love. He would sit by the lake every Sunday morning, a cup of coffee in his hand, and speak softly as if Katie were still listening. "I brought your favorite flowers," he would say, setting down a bunch of daisies. "The lake's still as calm as ever, Katie, and the sunsets, they look like the ones you always loved." Children from the nearby town sometimes came to play near the water. They didn't know the story, but they always stopped for a moment near the old oak tree, curious about the two names etched in the wood. Daniel would smile and tell them it's a love story, one that even time couldn't end. Years turned into decades. The town changed. New roads, new faces, new stories. But the legend of Katie and Sam remained. People said that on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills, you could still see two shadows walking by the lake, hand in hand. One spring evening, Daniel sat by the water, feeling his heartbeat slow with age. He looked at the sky, painted in shades of pink and gold, and whispered, "Katie, I think it's time." He closed his eyes and felt the wind brushed gently against his face. It carried a familiar scent, daisies and pine, and then he heard it. Soft laughter, distant yet clear, like the sound of youth returning. When the townsfolk found him the next morning, Daniel was sitting peacefully on the same bench, a gentle smile on his face. Beside him lay a single white daisy and a note that read, "She waited. Now I'm going to her." They buried him under the same oak tree next to Katie and Sam, completing the circle of love and life that had begun so many years ago. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees, those who passed by the lake swore they saw 3 faint lights dancing over the water, like souls reunited, glowing softly beneath the moonlight. And from that day on, whenever someone felt alone, they'd come to the lake, sit under that great oak, and feel the peace that lingered in the air, the peace of a love that never truly died. Because somewhere beyond time and memory, Katie and Sam walked together once more, their laughter echoing across the still water, eternal and free.